Welcome back, everyone, to Coffee and UFOs. This is the land of UAP and UFOs and enthusiasts like myself of caffeine. And we get to talk to really cool guests like James Clarkson. He'll be coming on. Um, it's been a while, and there's a lot to catch up on. James has a long history of investigation, going back decades now. And so, what we're going to do tonight is look at the history of ufology, and we'll be looking at skepticism, debunking, disinformation, and misinformation of the past, and use that to interpret what we're seeing today. So, let's welcome our guest, James Clarkson. James, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great, Alan. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It's absolutely a pleasure. You and I have had an opportunity to chat specifically about the Travis Walton case because I'm working on a little something there regarding that subject, and that's kind of where our conversation led to doing an episode together. So before we continue the conversation, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your expertise in ufology?
I've had two parallel paths in my life, the best way to explain it.
Hmm.
I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I graduated from high school in 1969 from a prep school in San Francisco, went to the University of California. Tumultuous time. Uh, I ended up dropping out, and then I ended up doing something that I never thought I would do, and it changed my life. I enlisted in the Army.
Mm.
It was at the tail end of the Vietnam War. I signed up for the military police. I ended up at Fort Lewis, Washington, right next to Tacoma in Washington State after military police school. And I've never left the state because I love it. I ended up doing two careers, basically.
Hmm.
I was a reserve deputy sheriff. I was a correctional officer, and then I became a full time sworn officer with the Aberdeen, Washington Police Department. I was there for 20 years, 10 years as a sergeant. Along the way, I liked investigations. That's always been what I really liked. In the Army,
Hmm.
I wore civilian clothes. I did not wear a uniform most of the time. So I love all things investigative. I was in charge of the fatal accident team. I've been a detective sergeant where I supervised all the detectives in the investigations unit. I had a knee injury. I had to leave. I worked a couple of years as a child abuse detective.
Hmm.
Then I got a job with the state of Washington as a fraud investigator and did 10 more years until I was at retirement age. So that's my professional career. There's
Yeah.
a lot of training and experience in all of that I've just described in short order. On the other side, long ago,
Hmm.
my interest in UFOs got started probably because of science fiction movies. As a
Hmm.
kid, I always liked science fiction more than anything else. And of course, I just got to say it, the big movie that changed me, The Day the Earth Stood Still with Michael Rennie, the original version.
Okay.
That's the immortal classic that says it all. And of course, there has now been some information that's been released to the public that apparently the CIA had their hand in the background of how that plot line was written. Not sure what that's all about, but it's an interesting fact from history.
Well, we
I
do know
heard,
from the Robertson panel that that was one of the guidelines for dealing with and managing the UFO phenomena.
sure, and let's see, the Robertson panel, that was 1952 or
52.
three.
I think it was, yeah, 2 or 3. Yep.
And well, it may have started in 52 and ended in 53.
Hmm.
But anyway, along the way, when I was a young man, it was actually a radio broadcast that changed my life. I happened to be listening to a radio show on KGO radio in San Francisco, and they were interviewing a gentleman named John G. Fuller, who had just written a book called Incident at Exeter. He also wrote the book called The Interrupted Journey, which was the first really good book about the Betty and Barney Hill alien abduction case. Exeter, New Hampshire turned out to be a hotbed of UFO activity in 1965. And I heard these stories that all centered around law enforcement officers being directly involved in seeing UFOs. In fact, one officer saw one so up close, he had a civilian standing next to him who was a witness, and he pushed the guy down onto the ground, and the officer dropped to one knee and started to draw his pistol. And then his backup officer screamed at him, "Don't do it, don't do it." And fortunately, he didn't.
Hmm.
And the thing flew off. The thing being a 50-foot disc with scintillating red lights going around the rim. And that's just one story of many. That
Yeah.
was a whole slew, a UFO flap of cases in Exeter, New Hampshire. Here's an interesting piece of history that I didn't know for many years. Convergent history. The young reporter from the closest newspaper who investigated the Exeter, New Hampshire sightings
Hmm.
was Peter Davenport, who
Oh,
later became the international director of the National UFO Reporting Center.
very interesting.
And weirdly, one night when I got to Washington State, I
Hmm.
was on we did duty day for 24 hours as the duty MPI.
Yeah.
So I'm during a slack time, I'm in the military police station, and I was having coffee with the desk sergeant, and he's got a big piece of plexiglass, and there are all these business cards next to all of his phones and everything else. A very busy place.
Hmm.
So I look down and I see this business card, and it says National UFO Reporting Center, 206 722 3000. And I said, Sarge, what's that? And he didn't even hesitate. He said, that's where we report UFOs. And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting.
like
Being,
like like it was a legit
yeah,
course of action. Yeah.
yeah. And we ended up having a pretty good discussion about things that he had heard about when he was in Europe and all of that. And I just kind of filed it away in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
Well, years later, I got out of the Army in 77. I became a reserve deputy sheriff. I ended up at Aberdeen PD. And it was a long time before I admitted to fellow officers that I was interested in UFOs. Meanwhile, all along throughout this whole process, I collected books, articles, anything that talks seriously about UFOs. Immediately, antenna goes up, my eyes open, and I'm absorbing it like a sponge. But I didn't talk to a lot of people about it.
Hmm.
Eh,
Well, I want to ask
But
you regarding that. I had an experience once when I was much younger, and about gosh, 20 years ago, and there was a what I know understand now. It was a meteorite, but or a meteor that entered the atmosphere. But at the time, there's people on this island that we were on, saw this event and like freaking out, and as young people were speculating as to what it was. And I remember one of the police officers uh, said at first we were talking to him and he's looking at like I don't know what this is. Because when a meteorite explodes it'll that light will linger for a little while,
mhm.
and so it was like, whoa. And then later we saw him again and he just looked at us and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. Deadpan, like was not even joking. And then we looked at what, we can't talk about this thing that we all just saw. um what's your take on that sort of behavior since you spent so much time in law enforcement?
Well, how it would depend on how big of an agency. I doubt that they had an actual policy, but in general, police officers are herd animals, and the pack that you're a part of, amongst yourselves, they're merciless when it
Hmm.
comes to gossiping and everything else. But obviously, they will, in a moment, put up a solid front to defend anybody or everybody if they have to. Well, a part of that behavior, though, is that you don't want to stick out. You don't want to step out on a limb and
Hmm.
start doing something. The other thing is, you definitely don't want to draw attention to yourself where it's going to come back and bite you either through the local press
Mm-hmm.
or through your chief of police and back down the chain of command to you. You don't want the boss to get put on the spot because you said something about UFOs last night and it got quoted. Because when you're an
Mm-hmm.
officer of the law and you're out there, you're a public figure
Yeah.
and people pay attention to what you say. Even if you say it casually or in a friendly way,
Sure.
you got to make sure. And most savvy cops are well aware of that. And so he took the safest course of action,
Mm-hmm.
which was to pretend like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So then you're also saying it's to protect potentially others.
Yes,
Right. So it is. There's actually something almost noble about it. I know that would ruffle a lot of feathers, people listening, but I think I can understand that. I can sympathize with that.
it's self preservation and it's
Yeah.
also preservation of the department. And you don't want to do anything. I mean, obviously, you've got everybody thinks that when you're a cop,
Mm-hmm.
and I suppose there are cops that think this way, but most cops that take the job really seriously, they don't think of themselves as being really, really powerful. They think of themselves as having all these responsibilities and all these things that they got to do, and they're
Mm-hmm.
pushing and pulling on you. And part of that, you have the law, you have rules and regulations, you have safety policies, you have and then you have civil liability and criminal liability that you're very well aware of.
Yeah.
Every everything that you do or don't do can be Monday morning quarterbacked by citizens,
Mm-hmm.
newspaper reporters, or the prosecutor's office,
Mm-hmm.
or your chain of command above you. So you learn to negotiate through all of that. But if you've got any brains at all, you're not going to do something, you're not going to take a big risk
Mm-hmm.
unless there's a possibility of a big return. I think a lot of them will bend the rules if that means the difference between getting a murder suspect in custody and not getting them in custody. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
they might bend some rules, but in general, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. It's interesting. You later became a MUFON investigator, and I have found being in MUFON, there are a lot of law enforcement and retired law enforcement officers that are investigators. Why do you think that is?
I think that we're swayed by the evidence.
Hmm.
Uh, Pilots, police officers, and military people, all of them in one way or another, you are a trained observer and you're basically trained to draw a logical conclusion from a series of facts.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone who is highly credible has an extraordinary experience, then you try to evaluate that objectively. Whereas what are the possibilities? What can you exclude? In fact, I could give it to you in a nutshell. What have I learned in almost 40 years of UFO investigation? I've learned that out of every 10 reports on the average, two of them are what I would call TRUFOs, true UFO sightings or encounters or whatever. The other eight fall into the categories of man made phenomena, natural phenomena, insufficient evidence, and then a very, very small percentage. This really doesn't happen very often, are hoaxed. Sometimes hoaxes can be major because they receive so much attention, but there are always two cases out of every 10 that are golden.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot to back me up on that. I actually went back through the MUFON CMS. I was trying to put together a special presentation, and I found 700 cases where I personally was the assigned investigator. Because when you're a state director, you end up working a lot of cases yourself because I don't know about what it's like. You're in New York, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what MUFON is like in New York, but I can tell you what it was in Washington. I came into that organization when it had been big, high, robust, and highly developed in Seattle but the people who were running it got old and tired, and they eventually had to retire. They passed the crown to me, and I ran it. But of course, I had full-time job, family, children, and I'm a MUFON state director. So, I'm working cases here and there, and you get stretched real thin.
Mhm.
And I don't know what your experience is with supervising volunteers, but the phrase herding cats comes to mind.
Well, I have to say, New York MUFON investigators and our state director Chris DePerno and John Lombardo. I mean, we've got like a great support system. Um, I love it so far. I mean, I think we've got a really good ethos
There are
within our
some
state.
tremendous people working in MUFON,
Hmm.
and I don't I definitely will get lost in the woods if we go into why and how I left MUFON.
Yeah, no,
There
we don't have to go
there's
there.
weird history there.
Yeah, I mean, if there's time, we can certainly do that. But
Yeah,
I am more interested in let's start with. I'd really like to start with the Turkey Springs Travis Walton case, because that's an example where you mentioned a very small percent of cases are hoaxes. And in that case, if it was a hoax, it was a very complex, sophisticated hoax, depending on which hoax theory you
oh yes.
subscribe to. And one of the things that I always thought about was one of the arguments with that case in particular, for it being a hoax, was, oh, they were exposed to the media. The Barney Betty and Barney Hill TV movie had come out a week before the event. This is 75. Um, then you had Spielberg's movies, and so they were influenced by Hollywood, and what gave them the idea to do the hoax, to pull this hoax off. Incentive to win the National Enquirer, payoff. Okay. The problem with that theory is that before and since then, collectively, millions and millions and millions of people have been exposed to Hollywood, TV movies, an unbelievable number of documentaries. And where are all the hoaxes? If this was such a big inspiration for hoaxing, where are they? The best we get in the past, I would say 15, 10 years, are CGI, fake UFOs and videos that
Right.
are posted on YouTube, which everybody pretty much figures out right immediately that it's computer generated. So what's your take on that idea?
Well, let's talk about Travis.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Right, go right to the heart of that. Number
Mhm.
one, I will freely admit, I not only am a believer that Travis Walton told the truth, I consider myself a friend of Travis Walton because I've appeared with him at so many conferences now. And in fact, my wife and Travis hit it off because they both had professional experiences in the medical field. Long story short, Travis Walton's life was totally upended. And, I think if he had it to do all over again, I'm not sure that he would have told anybody what happened
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it ruined his life. For many years, he said he couldn't even own a phone. It's one thing to tell a story once or twice or a few times, but having random people call you at 3 in the morning who want to know what your experience
Yeah.
was, that could get a little old real quick.
Hmm.
And the other thing I would point out, Travis Walton is one of the only stories that I know of where the Arizona Department of Public Safety actually went on record and there is a two-page letter, you can get it on the internet. It's
Hmm.
not hidden knowledge, signed by the polygraph operator
Sure.
who will he describes what questions he asked them and how
Mhm.
they all passed it, including a question, did you see a UFO or spaceship in
Yeah.
that clearing? And they all said yes. And they all passed. The only one who did not pass the polygraph was the only member of the group who had a criminal record. And he didn't pass like he flunked the polygraph. he didn't cooperate enough to give him a polygraph. That's the part they don't mention.
Yeah, and my understanding is that the reason he got skittish more so is because he didn't understand how polygraphs work. So
Exactly.
when they started asking him the same questions over and over again, he interpreted that as a interrogation.
Right.
And he freaked out because, like you said, he had a criminal record, and Alan Dallas did struggle with the law for some time after that, but eventually, he matured, and and then he did actually take the polygraph again.
And
Uh,
to be authorized
yeah.
to write about a UFO sighting on
Hmm.
official Arizona Department of Public Safety stationery and sign off with your name, position in
Hmm.
the agency saying that these witnesses were truthful. What I know about law enforcement officers, he would have never done that if he wasn't absolutely convinced that he was writing the truth. There's no reason to believe that the polygraph operator was in on it, or that he was just doing his job
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
law enforcement officer and writing an objective letter about the results of the polygraph exam. And the
Yeah.
other thing I would point out is I know how they select polygraph operators. And this is they pick one of their best detectives to become the polygraph operator because the polygraph interview often flips. A lot of confessions are obtained during the polygraph because you get the bad guy in there,
Hmm.
he decides to take the polygraph, and you being a nice detective, you say, "Look, haven't you got something you really want to get off your chest? I can tell this is bothering you, and I think you would really feel better if you told me the truth."
Hmm.
And hopefully they're going to go, "Oh, okay." And you got to be ready as a trained detective
Hmm.
to get start the interview, and it may lead to an interrogation and a confession and the whole bit.
Yeah.
And so the polygraph operator is not just any cop in the department.
No, well, and in this case, it was Cy Gilson who originally gave that polygraph test, and he was one of the best or the best in the state at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, he was a part of like the Arizona Polygraph Association and the National Polygraph Association, whatever those organizations are called. Um, and he was well respected and continued to be well respected for many years beyond that.
And so like then you take, I always ask, anytime somebody does something, the old question that detectives operate on is the Latin phrase "qui bono." I want to know who benefits. Whenever anybody does anything, they people take action because they make a decision because it benefits them in some way.
Hmm.
And so when you're trying to figure out what's the human motivation, why report this?
Hmm.
Why would I make it up? How do I gain anything by creating this hoax?
Well, let's flip that question too. What does Philip Klass or any other debunker gain from working so hard to try to skew the reality of the story?
I'm very cynical about a lot of debunkers, including Mr. Klass. And what do they gain?
Mhm.
Well, they probably gain satisfaction and qualifying for a bonus from their boss. In other words, I'm not convinced that Philip Klass wasn't on some kind of intelligence agency payroll. He
Mhm.
was so bad and so vicious
Mhm.
and so lacking in any investigative integrity. I'm sorry, but I don't think he was a objective skeptic. I don't mind objective skeptics. We need them.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I think you're right. I think his behavior speaks loudly because he also wasn't just a biased skeptic. He went to the 10th degree to slander, to try to confuse the story. I mean, that was like a full-time job on top of his Aviation Weekly, editing, which was his real job, right? And then he had the PsyCop magazine, for Skeptical magazine that he put out too. And it's like there's so many other interesting things in the world. Why are you spending an enormous amount of time
because that was
on
his
victims.
assignment.
That's what it feels like. It
And
feels like that.
I
Yeah.
have a great Philip Klass anecdote if we've got enough time for me to tell a quick
Oh,
story.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, 1995, Seattle, Washington was the MUFON Symposium.
Hmm.
That was in the golden age of MUFON in Washington State. They had signs up everywhere saying, do not record the proceedings without permission. So I was security for the event because at that time I was, a police officer. In fact, I was a sergeant with the police department. So I'm off duty, of course, at the MUFON Symposium, and I volunteered to be security. So this somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, Philip Klass is taping the proceedings."
Hmm.
So I walked down the row, and there he is. There's Philip Klass at the end of the aisle. Now he was getting up in years. He's sound asleep, sitting in his chair, holding a handheld tape recorder, and I can plainly see the little wheels turning inside, and the red light is lit, and two of the buttons are depressed. So he is clearly recording the conference. So I told someone, I said, get the MUFON photographer. And the photographer came up and I said, I want you to get in front of him, take a really good picture of him, and then step out of the way.
Hmm.
So he puts his camera up there. The flash goes off. I step in there, and Philip Klass wakes up, startled, looks at me, and I guess he immediately figured out why I was there.
Hmm.
And he, in a very clumsy way, he took the tape recorder and tossed it in the air
Mm.
and let it hit the carpet. And then he looks at me and he says, "Oh, it must have landed on the record button."
Wow.
And I said, "No, you're out of here. I'm security and you're out." So I escorted him out of the room and I got thunderous applause from everybody there. And unfortunately, they told him if he put his tape recorder away, he could get back in. I wanted to keep him totally out of there because I read him the riot act outside. I told him, I said, look, I said, I can't arrest you here, but I'm going to tell you that if you attempt to re-enter the premises or do any more unauthorized taping, I'm going to call the King County Sheriff and have them come out here and they'll make this very formal and you will be placed under arrest for trespass.
Did they let him back in?
They let him back in, darn it.
Okay. But he
That
didn't
made me
record after that.
No, he did not record.
Okay.
But so I know that Philip Klass is a liar. I know personally for a fact that that man has no integrity. If he would lie about a small thing
Mhm.
like that,
Yeah.
I certainly can't trust him on the big things.
So if he was the disinformation entity agent, whatever you want to call it, since he wasn't really on the books officially, uh, what how do you see parallels between what was going on then with him? You have other people like Robert Shear, then you have people which I would call more misinformation, which would be like Seth Shostak, where they're not purposely trying to disinform; they're just really hard headed in their
They're defending
biases.
it. They're
Yeah,
defending a particular perspective that they have, that they
yeah.
may have developed that over many years. And the problem is, and I think we got to be honest about this.
Mhm.
I try to be. There's no way to proceed in the field of ufology without doing a lot of speculation. There's just no way to do it.
True. Yeah.
I try to be reasonable and logical and keep it grounded, but you have to speculate. Why? Because if you didn't have to speculate, you would be interviewing an alien on your show and not me. In other words, or I'd be able to go out and contact one, or I would be able to go out. See, I have not had a close encounter event. I've seen odd lights in the distance that were very strange, but I have not had a close encounter event. I'm kind of like my big hero. He passed away, but I thankfully got to meet him a couple times. Was Stanton Friedman.
Oh, yeah.
I love the guy.
Yeah.
Everybody loves Stanton Friedman, unless you were a noisy negativist or a debunker. And then he was no fun in an argument.
He did not mince words when it
No, he
came to
did.
that. I
No, he
love it.
did
Yeah.
not. But
Yeah.
he was a great man, and he never had a close encounter. He did not see a UFO,
Right. Right.
but he was convinced by the evidence. I feel that my 20-year law enforcement career, another 10 years as a fraud investigator, I very seldom got to see somebody commit a crime in front of me.
Mm.
That's a rarity. That doesn't
Mhm.
happen very often.
Right. Yeah. Well,
I had
I was gonna ask you about that, James. So, because as a detective, you have perhaps pieces of evidence that you don't know where they fit, but
exactly
you don't let it go, right? You still
right. People
explore it.
tell me, people, especially after I was established in the city,
Mhm.
I knew a lot of people. I would deliberately, especially when I became a detective sergeant, I had these rounds that I would make. I'd go out and get in a car and go drive and meet somebody who worked in the hospital or who
Mhm.
worked at different businesses in town. I'd go in and say, "How you doing?" and have a cup of coffee with them. Why? Not because they were giving me any intense information, but because they would give me little tidbits.
Mhm.
I knew all kinds of things about all kinds of people. When you're a cop in a city and you've worked there a long time, you got the goods on everybody. But most of it is not actionable. Most of it never will be actionable. You have to have, and this is true of certainly of UFOs, you have to have a holding category, part of your brain where you say, well, that's interesting information, but I can't prove it. I can't prove it now, but maybe someday I will. Maybe not me, maybe somebody else will figure it out.
Mhm.
So that's, of course, is why you keep accurate records, why you try to write objective reports, why you try to do really good interviews. And of course, the other thing is that when you are a criminal investigator, anything that I develop out on the street or from people in the station or whatever, I have to walk into a prosecutor's office
Mhm.
and sit down and convince him. Because if I don't convince the prosecutor, it's dead in the water. And I've had many a prosecutor, you bring them these circumstances because you're all pumped up because you think you got it.
Mhm.
And the prosecutor will look at you and say, well, nice civil case, but you're it's not criminal.
Mm.
Well, okay, well, what do you need to make it criminal? And then the prosecutor will give you a laundry list and you're out the door to go work on the laundry list.
So
And then you,
UFOs are civil cases in most cases.
yeah, because you
Yeah.
don't quite have enough. It's
Yeah.
a question of burden of proof. In a civil case, all you got to do is tip the scales. If you get 51% of the evidence on your side, you prevail.
Mhm.
In a criminal case, you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the level of proof required to justify an arrest is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's kind of a nebulous area in between the two. It's more likely than not. And the other thing is, and this I believe is very, very true for all UFO investigators, all detectives, and all investigators, period. I was taught to be a little bit schizophrenic. You have to talk to an imaginary person who's with you all the time.
Mhm.
And every time I get into a situation, I have to be able to step back for a moment and say, what would a reasonable man or woman conclude if they were confronted by the evidence that's in front of me right now? Now, that might change.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
may get new evidence or different evidence or whatever, but what would a reasonable person conclude based upon what I know now? And if I've been very objective and I think, okay, a crime has been committed and I have now identified the perpetrator, then it's time to say, hey, you're under arrest. That's when you draw the line and you say the magic words. And it's like that in UFOs. Only obviously, I wish I could bring in an alien and a spaceship and, you know,
Well,
I'd be the
Well,
Go
that's
ahead.
what. No, sorry, that's what actionable evidence is, and that's what we want more of, right?
Yes. I
Yeah.
want something that will, was what I look for. There's going to be all kinds of people out there who are already completely convinced about their particular viewpoint. They're talking regularly to the Galactic Federation, or they've been right up and touched a spacecraft,
Hmm.
like somebody like John Burroughs, who actually did touch a UFO.
And he seems like a very sober person.
I would say so. He's
Yeah.
also, by the way, he's the first U.S. service member that we know of who got a disability from Uncle Sam because of permanent damage to his heart that was caused by to exposure to radiation from a UFO that was on the ground. Now,
Amazing.
that it is that's an amazing story by itself. And the other thing is, I guess I would stress before we get too far along, one of the things that I'm all about, and I'm glad you are, is the importance of our history.
Hmm.
And I believe that in recent times, there was a diabolical effort to erase our history,
Hmm.
and that battle is still being fought.
Yeah, and I'm going to be addressing this on my own way soon. But I do want to hear your take. What is going on? What the disinformation attacks back in the day seem to be a bit more blatant, uh, much more ad hoc, ad hominem. Now, what we're looking at is, I feel like it's actually a little more sophisticated.
Yes,
Yeah.
because
It's,
they've learned how to use social media to their advantage. And we have this incredibly powerful thing
mhm.
of social media. People can get on all the different platforms and say outrageous things or debunk. They can just say, "Oh, that's impossible because, I've heard that he's an alcoholic." Even if you have no information,
Yeah.
no evidence that that person is an
Mhm.
alcoholic, and you can say something like that, and everybody always remembers the outrageous allegation. They don't remember the retraction.
Well, also previously, the debunking efforts were directed at your lay, mostly lay eyewitness. You have sawyers and loggers like the
Yes.
crew at Turkey Springs and other people. But now I think they have it forced to be more sophisticated because these were Navy videos in 2017 that were released, and the New York Times reported on it, and there was a legitimizing of it. And you can't just go character assassinating all of these pilots, right? You just can't do that. So they had to come up with something else. So I guess my question is is the UAP task force Arrow uh, a front akin to Project Blue Book, or is there a sincere effort going on there?
I'm sure there are sincere people working there, but I am not a Dr. Fitzpatrick fan.
Hmm.
I believe that he was a debunker. He was certainly meant to keep the lid on and broadcast the establishment position. There's no significant activity, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And
Hmm.
he what he did with Arrow would be like a chief of police who ran a police department where he made sure that his officers never left the station and they never arrested anybody. Well,
Hmm.
of course he could turn around and say there's no crime because unless the criminals walk in the front door and confess, he has no evidence to the contrary.
Hmm.
I know a gentleman here in Washington State. He's a friend of mine who is one of the missile control officers who he dealt with Arrow. He went there in good faith to make a statement, and they treated him in an extremely unprofessional manner. And he ended up writing back a very terse reply, calling him out on how they operated.
Right. Well, and the way Kirkpatrick spoke about David Grush, I thought it was very demeaning and dismissive.
Yes,
which I thought was disrespectful. But we've seen worse in the past. But I think what is most concerning is the fact that Grush and apparently multiple other eyewitnesses, like you said, have gone to Arrow, have tried to report, and Arrow is saying no one ever came to us.
Right. It, they, it's
It's
it's just
gaslighting. Just
there.
yeah.
There is a war going on. The first
Hmm.
thing you've got to do, people have to. We tend in ufology to say the government says this or the government is doing that.
Correct.
Okay, first off, 95% of the people who work for the United States government are not as well informed about UFOs as you or I are.
Hmm.
They don't care about it. It's not part of their job. It's not part of their world. They don't have anything to do with it. So there is a small percentage who care very deeply. And I do believe, and I've been, working on some of the back history of this. There has been a war bubbling away, a cold war occurring within the halls of power, within the Pentagon, within the defense establishment for a long time. And it finally has broken out, and certain factions have now gone public.
Hmm.
I think, a perfect example of that was, I think it was 2017 when it started, the To the Stars Academy that was headed up by Tom DeLonge.
Hmm.
And we were fed a myth. It was all over television and is still out there that Tom DeLonge, a well meaning rock star with an interest in UFOs, he bravely went into the Pentagon and dragged these people out and brought them and got them to
Hmm.
tell all the deep secrets about UFOs. That's baloney. Okay. These, if you looked at the board of directors, the advisory board of that,
TTSA.
yeah, the TTSA, they've got like 300 years of experience in the intelligence and scientific fields.
Hmm.
All the stuff that these people did in their backgrounds requires high level security clearances. And these people are, they know what they can say and what they can't say.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if they say anything, it's because they have calculated it before they've said it. They're
Have
not
you
going to let the cat out of the bag.
have you read Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic?
No, I
It's
got it
a
over here on the shelf.
Oh, yeah.
It's
That
on
was
my
one of
to
those
do
books
list.
that yeah, it was one of those books that was on my shelf for a long time too. But she highlights in the book, and she, recognizes Jacques Vallée, the invisible college,
Hmm.
and meaning that behind the scenes there are these very intelligent, very successful scientists and otherwise perhaps government officials that are aware of the NHI, the non-human intelligence presence, and some of them claim to interact with it, and they're successful in their careers, but they just can't share that information. Now, with the Soul Foundation, and obviously the past 5 years, I am more encouraged. I think we're on the right path.
We're definitely further along than we were, and God bless David Grush. I think he's a very brave man. I
Mhm.
admire him. I would buy him a beer anytime, and I would gladly shake his hand and say what an honor it was to meet him. I have total respect for him.
Same here, but I'll buy him a coffee.
There you go. That's true. He may not want to have a beer, but the other person in the same line that I've come to respect, I've actually communicated with him by email several times, is Russ Coulthart,
Mm.
who wrote In Plain Sight and was one of he was the journalist who, investigative reporter, who I guess knew David Grush better than anybody else and got him to kind of, helped him when he decided to come out of the shadows.
Yep.
And so, what a tremendous service that was. We are better off than we were. We are now talking openly
Mhm.
about concepts that a few years ago, nobody would have talked about non-human intelligence. Now, for God's sake, there's a legal definition of it. The bill did not pass, but the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act with
Mhm.
the Chuck Schumer amendment, it actually had a legal definition in it of the observables that make something into a UAP and a definition of non-human intelligence.
Do you think the amendment um, still has any teeth left on it?
Hard to say.
Mm.
It lost a lot. They took a lot out of it. It's
Yeah.
kind of a sad. It's kind of a shadow of what it was. But the mere idea of there being an amendment a few years ago would have been impossible. So we're always, I guess, after 30 some years of being in UFOs, I get really excited too. When David Grush came out, I listened to every word, and I thought it finally happened.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. We're going to make them disclose something. They're going to admit that Roswell was real. No,
Mhm.
they're not. It's always been two steps forward and one step back.
A quick question for you, or maybe not very quick. How many crashes do you really think took place between 47 and 48?
Hmm. 47 and 48.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't
you have
remember I don't remember the dates of the other two, but I do I can quote my good friend June Crane, who worked at Wright Patterson in a top secret laboratory, and she said that by the time she left their employment in 1953, that
mhm,
there were three crashed UFO recoveries that she knew of that had been discussed in the office where she worked. Roswell was one.
okay.
We thought that the other one was Kingman, Arizona.
Hmm.
She wasn't sure at all about the third. And she really did not. She the only one she was sure of was Roswell.
Well, Roswell, there's the argument that there were two craft or two crash sites, and the second was not discovered until much later. Could that account for the seeming report of two crashes?
Well, I actually have a different version of that, which is that there was a kind of a bounce site where the object hit and lost some of its mass. And then there's the place where it finally came to rest miles away. The first location was Mac Brazel's ranch, and it was discovered. And since the public basically knew about it, they weren't letting the cat out of the bag by saying that they had recovered something and then turning around and saying, oh no, it was just a weather balloon. They wanted to keep that other site secret at all costs, and they did.
Right. And now we also think that perhaps the Trinity site was a real crash. I know Jacques and Paula Harris, had come out with a book. Are you shaking your head no?
I am really shaking my head no.
Okay.
Uh, I, I, before anybody ever heard about this being a book,
Mhm.
I was on the director's special investigations team in MUFON. Paola Harris went to the director and said that she wanted part of her story investigated
Mhm.
because she was arguing that there were noxious weeds that had been genetically altered and deliberately planted at the Trinity site to keep investigators away from finding any debris that might still be left. And
She wrote yeah.
okay, um, we attempted to do that.
Mhm.
The noxious weeds turned out to be gypsum weed and some other kind of common weed. There's no
Okay.
evidence of genetic alteration. That did not hold water. And then, of course, we were told only to investigate just that narrow part of the story and that we were not to investigate what it was that Jose Padilla claimed to be holding on to, that odd piece of cast aluminum
Mhm.
that he claims they had taken from the inside
Inside, yeah.
of a crashed flying saucer. And I will tell you that in fact, I know for a fact, because he told me this over and over again, I know somebody who directly examined that piece
Hmm.
scientifically, and he does not believe there's any truth to it at all. And that's Frank Kimbler, who is a well known Roswell researcher in Roswell, New Mexico. He's the science teacher, and now I think he's a school administrator at the New Mexico Military Academy. A very, very reputable scientist, researcher, all around good guy for the field. He does not believe in this case. There's a man named Douglas Wayne Johnson who has a website called Mirador. I was contacted by him because he had heard that we had investigated the Paola Harris claims, the Trinity claims, and he basically, there's a website where people can go and read multiple articles that basically proves that Jose Padilla has been involved not just in hoaxing but in stolen valor.
Mm.
He claims to be carrying around a bullet that he received as a highway patrol officer in California, and another bullet that he's carrying around because he was a Korean War veteran and was in combat. The problem with that is he would have had to have been about 14 years old in order to be wounded in Korea when he
Hmm.
was in the Army. And the other problem is, after doing extensive record checking, there is no evidence that he was ever a California highway patrolman.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
what I'm driving at
Yeah.
is, on multiple fronts, the Trinity case does not hold up because the two primary witnesses are not credible.
Well, Jacques Vallée, to put his name to that book. Uh,
That you've got me. You
yeah.
I am stunned. I have the until this investigation, I looked up to Jacques Vallée as like one of the old wise men on the mountain
Hmm.
because he has contributed so much to this field.
And
He
he
is,
is wise. Yeah.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah. I don't
I
know.
guess I guess maybe when you get older, I'm 72, you're prone to doing foolish things. I just cannot believe that any professional investigator, after they fully examined the evidence, would say that there was any credibility to the Trinity case.
Yeah.
They even have an he even has an audio tape of Remy Baca saying that he was going to organize this as a money making story, that he and his friend Jose Padilla, in the future, at the time the tape was made, were going to commit a hoax for money.
See, now
About
I would have to hear that whole recording because this brings us back to the Walton case because not, just a few years ago, 2021, there was that snippet of an audio recording of allegedly Mike Rogers admitting it was a hoax, and it blew
oh, I
up.
remember that.
And what it really was, and Mike and I were trying to figure it out. Our initial reaction was it must be a manipulated audio. It must have spliced things together to try to make it sound like it. Because Mike Rogers, he really didn't understand. He's like, okay, I hear my voice, I don't understand this. And then it turned out really all it was Mike was doing what many people do when they're telling a story from someone else's perspective. So he was telling this guy who was recording him what Philip Klass's theory was. So he's speaking in from that perspective as Philip Klass, like, oh, Philip Klass, said blah 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 blah. Travis and I were hanging out in the woods, we're having a conversation, and I told Travis about this idea and da da da. Da. Like the way I'm speaking right now, that we do that all the time as people when we're telling stories. What made it obvious after a while was where it was edited. It was
Right.
a very short, cut in here, cut out. Actually, when that ends, when they transition to another part of the conversation, the end of that doesn't seem to make sense because Mike makes a comment like he was, surprised to see a UFO. So in the same recording, is he's supposed to be admitting a hoax while also saying he was, surprised about this real UFO. So obviously,
Well, obviously, you need to listen to the recording for yourself. But what I'm saying is,
yeah.
if you, as an investigator, go on there, you can find a huge amount of evidence
Hmm.
that basically sinks Trinity. I'm sorry, but that one has zero credibility for
And
me.
you said it was Matador. Is that the
Mirador.
mirror?
It's Douglas. Oh, let's see if I can get it on. Douglas, is it W. Wayne Johnson? I'm pretty sure it's Douglas Johnson, and it's the Mirador,
Got it.
Mirador website. There, it'll keep you busy. There's a huge amount of information on there, and I am a contributor out of a whole team of people
Hmm.
who investigated that.
Okay. And for everyone else listening, also check out James's website, jamesclarksonufo.com. James, this flew by. We
I
have to do
know.
we have to do this again, honestly. But if you can just kind of wrap it up for us as best as you can, and leave us with where you think we are right now, and any last thoughts that you want to leave us with.
We are in a much better place than we've ever been for the reasons that we've stated. I would advise people who are coming into this field, you've got to do some reading. You need to go back and get some of the primary books, because there are several UFO books that I could certainly cite that are almost undisputed
Hmm.
because of the quality. Like UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings.
Sure.
That's a man's life work. And to make a long story short, UFOs and all things nuclear go together like coffee and cream. You can put that in the bank. If
Cheers.
you have something nuclear, just wait around.
Hmm.
There's a good UFO case there to be investigated.
Oh yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
and where there is smoke, there is fire. And don't believe it when they tell you. I just don't believe them when they tell me that they've got it all figured out
Hmm.
and nothing to see here, folks. Don't worry about it. You got to study for yourself, but
True.
you have to stay objective.
All right. So everyone stay objective. And again, do check out James's website. That's jamesclarksonufo.com. James, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure.
All right. And thank you for joining us for another conversation of coffee and UFOs. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the myriad of topics that we covered tonight, but particularly modern debunking. I'm really curious as to what other people are seeing. And am I seeing, is James seeing, are we all seeing the same thing, or are you picking up on something that we're all missing out on? I have a lot to say about that in the coming months. And of course, if you are a fan of this podcast, please like, subscribe, comment down below, click the notification bell, and wherever you listen to this podcast, please give a good rating. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Peace and love. And until next time, everyone, live in the UFO mystery.